I found out my mother didn't live in my house anymore 3 days after I buried my husband. I was still wearing black. I hadn't done the dishes from the funeral reception. There were still casserole dishes on the counter with other women's names taped to the bottom. When a letter came from the county recorder's office, addressed to the current owner, I opened it standing in the kitchen, still in my stockings, and read the word quitclaim 4 times before it made sense. My mother had signed our house over to my brother while I was picking out a casket. But let me back up. I moved back to Millhaven 6 years ago, right after my father's funeral, because somebody had to. That's how my mother put it. Somebody has to. Like it was a fact of weather and not a request. My brother Curtis was 38 then, living outside Charlotte, running a landscaping company that always seemed to be one bad season from folding. He came home for the funeral, cried harder than anyone, and left 48 hours later. I stayed. I told myself it was temporary. Ben and I still had our place across town for the first year, and I drove over every morning to get Mom her pills and make sure she hadn't left the stove on. Then her hip went, and it made more sense for us to just move in. Ben never complained. He used to joke that he'd married into a 2-for-1 deal, a wife and a mother-in-law, and he set up a workshop in the garage like a man who intended to grow old there. He never got the chance. An aneurysm, no warning, 43 years old, gone between one Tuesday and the next. I spent 3 weeks underwater, planning a funeral, learning what a life insurance claim actually requires of a grieving person, forgetting to eat. My mother was there for some of it, in the vague, apologetic way she'd been vague and apologetic about most things since Dad died. What I didn't know was that in the middle of that fog, my brother had flown in. He told her he'd come to support me. He stayed at her house, my house, the house I'd been paying the property taxes on for 4 years, instead of a hotel, which should have been my first clue, because Curtis doesn't do inconvenience. He took her to lunch. He brought her a cashmere robe from some boutique in Charlotte and told her she deserved to be spoiled. He sat with her in the evenings while I was at the funeral home negotiating over urns, and somewhere in those 4 days, over what I can only assume was a bottle of the good sherry, he told her a story. A story about how he never got his fair share of Dad's estate, how he'd stepped back and let me take over, out of love, out of sacrifice, so that she'd never want for anything. How the least she could do, the least, was make sure the house didn't just disappear into whatever mess Dana's life was about to become, now that she was a widow with no husband's income. He didn't ask her to give him the house. He asked her to protect it. That was the word he used, according to what she told me later, half crying. Protect. And my mother, 72 years old, exhausted, lonely, and starving for a son who almost never called, drove herself to a shipping store with a notary on staff and signed a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership of the house to Curtis Whitfield. 4 days. That's all it took to undo 6 years. I called her the second I understood what the letter meant. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting, dreading it, maybe even a little proud of herself in that fragile way people get when they've finally done something for someone besides the person who's always in the room. Curtis said it would take a weight off my shoulders, she said. He said you had enough to worry about. I remember standing in my kitchen, unable to speak, while my mother explained to me, gently, like I was the one being unreasonable, that my brother had done this for me. I called Curtis that night. He answered on the 4th ring. Background noise of a restaurant behind him, ice clinking. Dana, hey, how are you holding up? Like he didn't know. like the letter hadn't come from a filing he'd personally walked into a recorder's office. I asked him, flat out, if he'd had our mother sign the house over to him. There was a pause. Not guilt, I'd learn later, just recalibration. And then he said, "It's not what you think. I was going to call you about it." I asked him to explain what I should think instead. He said, "Look, I gave up a lot when I let you take the caregiving stuff. I never said anything, but that was my inheritance too. And I walked away from it so you could have your time with her. I think Mom just finally saw that." He said it so evenly, like it wasn't a threat, like he wasn't holding the deed to my house in his hand while I sat in a kitchen full of other people's casserole dishes with my husband 3 days in the ground. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark of a bedroom that belonged, on paper, to my brother, and I thought about the years I'd spent driving my mother to dialysis-adjacent appointments that never quite became dialysis, filling her pill organizer every Sunday, sitting with her through 2 small strokes that scared us both quiet. I thought about Ben, sanding a birdhouse in the garage on a Sunday afternoon, whistling because he was happy, because he thought this was going to be our life. And I thought, they can just do this. They can just take it. There's no lock on grief that keeps people out. If anything, it's an open door. The next morning, I called Priya. She'd been my best friend since we were 15, and for the last 9 years, she'd worked as a paralegal at a firm downtown that did, among other things, real estate and elder law. I told her everything in one long, unbroken sentence, and when I finally stopped to breathe, she was quiet for a second, and then said, "Send me the deed, today. Don't call him again until I've looked at it." It was the first order anyone had given me in weeks that I actually wanted to follow. 2 days later, she called back, and I could hear in her voice that she was trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Dana, I need you to not get your hopes up, but I need you to also come sit down because there's something wrong with this notarization." "Wrong how?" I asked. She said the notary's log, the book every notary is legally required to keep, listing the date, the signer, the ID used, didn't match. The deed was dated the Thursday of that week. The notary's log had no entry for Eleanor Whitfield that day at all. Either the notarization was backdated, or it never properly happened the way the document claimed. "That's not a technicality," Priya said. "In this state, that can be enough to void the whole thing." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in 3 weeks, and then, almost immediately, tighten again. Because Curtis wasn't going to just hand the house back because of a clerical error. Men like Curtis don't fold on paperwork. They lawyer up, or they charm harder, and either way, I was going to need more than a mismatched logbook. I was going to need to prove he'd known exactly what he was doing. That's when I remembered the texts. Over the years, Curtis and I had exchanged more messages about our mother's care than either of us probably wanted to admit. Mostly me updating him, mostly him responding days later with a thumbs-up emoji. But buried in 9 years of that thread were things I'd forgotten. A message from him 4 years back, half joking. "Enjoy the caregiving Olympics, I'm staying out of it. You're better at this stuff than me anyway." Another, after Dad's funeral, when I'd asked if he wanted to split Mom's care costs. "I can't right now, but I'm not going to forget what you're doing for her. You'll be taken care of." A voicemail I'd saved without knowing why, from 2 years ago. His voice loose with wine at some family gathering. "You're the one she trusts, not me. I couldn't do what you do. Seriously, Dana. The house is basically yours anyway at this point." He'd said it himself, repeatedly. Not under oath, not in writing that would hold up as a contract, but enough, Priya said. Enough to paint a picture no judge or mediator would enjoy looking at. A man who spent 9 years telling his sister the house was hers in every way that mattered. And then, the week she buried her husband, told their mother a different story entirely. I want to be fair to him here, because it would be easy not to be. When I finally sat across from Curtis at Priya's office, with her present, because I didn't trust myself alone with him, he didn't look like a villain. He looked tired. He told me about the loan, $210,000, a landscaping business that had expanded too fast right before a slow year, a house of his own that was 3 missed payments from foreclosure. He said, "I know how this looks, but Dana, I spent 19 years watching Dad build that house up and never getting a say in what happened to it. And then Mom needed help, and it was like the whole family just decided, without asking me, that helping meant you get closer and I stay far. I didn't choose to be the one who left. I just wasn't as good at staying as you are." His voice cracked on that last part, and for one terrible second, I almost reached across the table, because some old, tired part of me still wanted to take care of him too. Then he said, "I just thought, for once, something could be mine without me having to fight the whole family for it." And I realized he still believed the house owed him something my 6 years hadn't already paid for. That was the version of Curtis I understood. Scared, underwater, telling himself a story where he was the overlooked one. It was almost sympathetic. Almost. But sympathy isn't the same as innocence, and a man can be genuinely afraid and still hand his grieving sister a lie wrapped in his mother's shaky signature. We didn't go to court in the end. Priya's letter, laying out the notarization defect and delicately referencing a documented pattern of prior representations, was enough to get Curtis's own attorney to advise him to settle rather than litigate a deed that wouldn't survive scrutiny. He signed a new quitclaim, transferring the house back to me alone, not to my mother, a detail Priya insisted on. "Next time somebody flatters her over Sherry," she said, "there won't be anything left to sign away." The house came back to me on a gray Tuesday in October, almost 2 months after Ben died, and it did not feel like winning. What it felt like was sitting in my mother's kitchen a week later, both of us quiet, when she finally said the thing I'd been waiting 6 years to hear, without knowing I was waiting. She said, "I let myself believe Curtis was doing something generous, because it had been so long since anyone did anything for me that felt like a gift instead of a duty. And I think somewhere in me, I knew that made what you do feel less like love and more like a job. I'm sorry, Dana. I took you for granted because you never once made me feel like I couldn't." I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't. Not entirely. And I've learned this year that some sentences don't need forgiveness attached to be worth saying out loud. I still live in that house. I still drive my mother to her appointments on Thursdays. But I don't do it anymore believing that being needed is the same thing as being loved. I do it because I choose to, and because now, finally, someone in my family can tell the difference too. Ben used to say, "Love is what people do when nobody's keeping score." I spent 6 years keeping the score without meaning to, hoping someone else would notice the tally. It turns out I had to lose almost everything to make my mother finally look at the numbers herself.